What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and with She-Hulk coming out, a lot of you all had asked me to make a video explaining Frogman, and to be honest, I think he's gonna be the standout star of the She-Hulk show, to be quite frank with you guys. If they do him accurately like he is in the comics, because in the comics, Frogman is amazing. I love his character, or at least he was. More recently, he had kind of a return to the classic Frogman, which was awesome. But here's the thing, there's two variations of the character, and the funny thing about this is the origin for Eugene, who's the one that we'll be talking about here, kind of gives us a little bit of an origin for his father, Vincent, which is actually sort of explained a little bit earlier. So the way this worked is that Frogman first appeared in Marvel Team-Up issue number 121 in 1982, and he was created by J.M.D. Mateus. Now, what's funny about this is that by and large, the appearances of Frogman are going to be almost exclusively confined to J.M.D. Mateus stories. There are other people who invoke him, but like 80 to 90% of his appearances are in Mateus stories, which is kind of funny here. But the way this works in Marvel Team-Up, and this is one of the things to know, back in the day, Marvel Team-Up was a very long-running comic, and it was a very, very popular comic in its time. And you saw it play a few different roles. You saw team-up stories, which of course followed the namesake, so you'd see Ben Grimm and different things along those lines, but it was usually characters who were like teaming up in stories that you wouldn't normally see them team up in, and then in turn it was just kind of a fun way to introduce other characters as well. And so the introduction of Frogman comes by way of his father Vincent, who basically hates superheroes. At the outset, we're not really given a definitive explanation as to why, but what we get in the story itself is just some instance whereby he came into conflict with Daredevil. Now, the reality of this is that this story was told in Daredevil issue number 25, which came before Eugene's appearance in Marvel Team-Up. And the way this worked is that Eugene's father, Vincent, was by all standards of measurement a loser, is basically what he was. And he simply wanted to prove that he could be somebody. And so ultimately he ended up fashioning a costume for himself that had springs in the feet, started calling himself Leapfrog, and then went on a life of crime. He ended up being defeated by Daredevil, and then he was thrown in jail. And his wife, Rosie, didn't make enough money to keep them financially stable until she died of cancer. And so at the moment, what you have is Vincent, who's basically haunted by the mistakes of his past, and of course, time lost with his wife, who ended up passing away, and he's the one there to raise his son Eugene. And so after hearing this story, what Eugene ends up doing is actually donning the costume in order to basically restore his father's honor and make up for his past disgrace, and then starts calling himself the Fabulous Frogman. Now, this was really kind of a cool thing because at the outset, because it was a Marvel Team-Up story, it was Spider-Man teaming up with Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. And so what you ended up having was basically a kind of a handful of criminals that robbed a bank. They were ultimately defeated, but the Spider-Man villain Speed Demon returned and then took off with the money. And so what this did is it led to a team-up between Spider-Man and the Human Torch to try to defeat Speed Demon. But when Eugene jumped in as Leapfrog and then basically bungled his way through the story, he actually ended up aiding in defeating Speed Demon. And so it was one of those things where he sort of established himself, even if only by accident, that while he wasn't a high-level superhero, he wasn't an Avenger or anything like that, the guy could do some good. But one of the cornerstones of his character in these early stories is that he would literally just happen to succeed, right? He had no idea what he was doing, and he would oftentimes screw things up more than he got things right. This was built on in kind of a return in Marvel Team-Up issue number 131 in 1983 with J.M.D. Mateus, which was actually the second part of Eugene's story that initially kicked off in Marvel Team-Up 121. And the cool thing about this and the way this worked is that you basically picked up with a villain by the name of White Rabbit, who is basically a villainess, right? A female villain that was largely modeled after the White Rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. And so ultimately everything just kind of, she's going on a criminal spree and all that kind of stuff. And what ends up happening is that Joe Face, who was at one point a criminal ally to Vincent, the father of Eugene, basically brings him back into the criminal fold by having him work on the team of White Rabbit. And it gets a little funny because there is a point where like Spider-Man shows up and all that kind of stuff, and White Rabbit's like, let's all get out there and kill them. And the response of like Vincent is, look, I mean, I'm all down for like robbing some banks and stuff, but I don't know if I'm down for like murdering folks, and he's like, why are we even gonna do that? And she's like, because it's fun, and so ultimately, of course, he's basically saved and the day is saved by Eugene alongside Spider-Man. And then you end up finding out that the way White Rabbit was essentially arrested is that following the attempt of Joe Face to get Vincent back into the criminal life, that Vincent had actually turned informant for the cops, and he basically was wearing a wire. So everything that White Rabbit had said in front of him was recorded, handed over to the cops, and that's how she ended up getting being busted. The significance behind this was that it was Vincent who was actually inspired by Eugene's superhero antics to try to change his ways and to actually sort of make up for his past misdeeds. And so what was really cool about this is that you jump to Amazing Spider-Man number 247 in 1983, which was written by Roger Stern. Now, this is one of those instances where JMD Mateus had kind of kicked off Frogman. He introduced him as a kid who was really trying, and that's one of the things that you loved about his character back in the day. He was basically a kid that you just kind of had to root for. He would screw up, again, more often than he would do things right, but you just wanted to see him succeed. And so this is one of those instances where he would just kind of get in the way. He didn't appear in the story very long, and in fact, that would be an on-running theme for his character that really ran all the way up until 1987, when he effectively disappeared out of comics for a handful of years and then came back shortly after. But at this point, it was one of those instances when like he idolized Spider-Man, and so he would simply just appear in a story, and he would usually screw something up, Spider-Man would chastise him and then send him home, and that was basically it. And so in this particular instance, in Amazing Spider-Man 247, that you actually had Spider-Man who was hot on the heels and had caught up to a handful of criminals that had basically had these plans and so on and so forth. In the midst of Spider-Man's attempt to deal with them, literally Eugene flies in from a skylight and it's just like, surprise bitches! Nobody suspects the fabulous Frogman, and ends up screwing everything up. And in fact, because of the antics, because he actually knocks Spider-Man into a pile of tires, that basically it allows the criminals to grab their plans and leave. And so of course Eugene just gets screamed at by Spider-Man, who ends up taking off. Now at that point, again, this is one of the things behind the stories, he would just kind of appear off and on in little moments. And so the following year, in the New Defenders issue number 131, which I call it the New Defenders, it was the continuation of the original Defenders comic, albeit the roster had shifted up at this point, but it was in 1984 and again written by JMD Mateus, and Eugene actually tried to join the team. And this was again kind of a humorous and a funny moment because at the time, Beast, who was sort of sharing a role where he was one part X-Men, one part Avengers, one part Defenders, he was kind of playing that role of Wolverine where he was like on all the teams long before Wolverine did that. But you had Beast who was actually making a speech, and then a villain named Walrus showed up out of nowhere who tried to attack Beast at that conference, and then of course Eugene helps the Defenders to defeat Walrus and then tries to join the team. Now the on-running theme behind this is that the Defenders are kind of like, no man, like I mean because the rumors and really the stories about Frogman are essentially circulating around the superhero community. Spider-Man ends up getting the most grief out of everybody, right? He's the one whose day kind of ends up getting ruined by Frogman more than anybody else. But the antics of Frogman have circled around enough to where nobody really wants to have him on the team. And that's kind of the sad thing behind it, because again, like you're just kind of like, he tries so hard, and I want to see him succeed, but you know he would bungle everything up if he were on the Defenders or any of those teams. And even the Defenders are like, no, we'd be a laughingstock if we let this guy on the team. That's not going to happen. But fortunately for them, they are spared the heartache of having to break it to Eugene that he's just not good enough to be on the team when Eugene's dad shows up and then chastises him. And that was one of the undercurrents that was going on with Eugene in the early days of his appearances, is that despite the fact that he had donned the suit and basically helped to defeat Speed Demon in his early appearances, and his dad was proud of him for that, the reality here is that his father would often chastise him for going out in these superhero antics. Now, it wasn't because his father hated him being a hero. If anything, and it really wasn't well shown by his dad, it was more based on the idea that his father was afraid something would happen to him. Not only that, it was really Eugene just kind of going out there and doing things and usually causing problems. And so it was one of those situations where his father was also concerned that because of what Eugene was doing, that he would actually make a negative reputation for himself as opposed to a positive one, and everybody would avoid him. Going into Amazing Spider-Man issue 266 in 1985, this was written by Peter David. And this was a really cool story because what you end up having here is the formation of what was called the Misfits, which was the greatest team we never got to see. I always loved the idea behind it, and I really wish we'd gotten the stories of the Misfits. We never got them, and it would have just like literally, well, okay, so the way this plays out, the way this goes down is you ended up having Toad from the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who is basically trying to kill himself by jumping off a building. Now, Toad is a character who had been around for quite some time. He was always kind of a lackey, to be honest, right? I mean, the depiction of him in like the old Fox X-Men movies actually did him more justice than how he was in the comics. He was okay, but the reality is he was originally part of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, but he was never really a guy you could take seriously. And in fact, there came a point when he had left the Brotherhood and had struck out on his own, but had still continued to fail in his various schemes. And so what this did is it led to him trying to simply just off himself due to his failures as part of the Brotherhood and also going solo. solo, but he was ultimately saved by Spider-Man, who actually offered Toad his friendship. And so this turned into a situation where Toad kind of became that socially awkward guy that just can't recognize social cues. The funny thing here is that there comes a point when, because Toad is basically spending time with Spider-Man, albeit Spider-Man constantly trying to reject him because he's like, we're not partners, this ends up making the news. And the news actually broadcasts it from the direction of saying Toad is the new partner of Spider-Man. Now, of course, this pisses off Eugene because from Eugene's perspective, he was always rejected by Peter Parker, right? Peter Parker's stance was always like, hey man, I mean, you're cool sometimes, I guess, but like, we're not partners. And so as a result of this, Frogman, Eugene actually picks a fight with Toad. Spider-Man intervenes and then simply tells them they should form their own team. That's just called the Misfits, in order to just kind of allow Spider-Man to get rid of Eugene and Toad, kind of push them both out of the way. And we never got the stories of the Misfits. Marvel, if you see this, give us stories about the Misfits, right? Just do it like as a retcon, right? Like way back in the day, these are the stories of Misfits. But instead, the next time we ended up seeing Frogman actually came in Marvel Fanfare issues 31 and 32 in 1987, which again was written by J.M.D. Mateus. Now, Marvel Fanfare was kind of one of the unsung heroes of Marvel Comics, to be honest, in terms of a publishing side. It was a team-up book, but it was also more of an anthology book. The difference between something like Marvel Fanfare and Marvel Premiere or Marvel Presents or Journey into Mystery or Tales to Astonish or whatever is that Marvel Fanfare was actually an anthology book designed to showcase the very best talent that Marvel had at the time. So if you were a writer or an artist and you were approached by Al Milgrom, who was the editor at the time, and in fact he edited the series for the whole 10-year run, if you were approached by him and it was, hey, would you like to have a hand in crafting a story in Marvel Fanfare, it meant that you were very, very high on the talent list, or you were rising talent that was getting noticed by the right people. And so Marvel Fanfare had a pretty solid following, and it had some great stories, as you would expect from some of the best writers and artists from Marvel coming at the time. And so what you ended up getting in this Marvel Fanfare story, which actually stretched over issues 31 and 32 back in 87, is you actually had Frogman meeting Captain America for the very first time. Now, again, much like his encounter with Spider-Man, Steve Rogers didn't want to partner with Frogman because he knew about his stories. He'd heard from Peter Parker that, hey man, like this guy just kind of screws things up. And so what had happened is that Frogman actually started investigating essentially what seemed like a murder, and then told everybody that him and Steve were partners anyway. And so Eugene's investigation actually leads him to the lair of Yellow Claw, who, if we're being honest with ourselves, he was basically just a racist-ass caricature from back in the day. He literally was. Like, he was just the evil Asian bad guy. He was that caricature that just simply hadn't gone away by that point. Now, before a lot of you guys who love to be angry start freaking out over this, he's long since gone, right? So, you're gonna be getting pissed off about something that came to an end years and years and years ago. But of course, the concern of Steve Rogers, once he learns that Eugene has been telling everybody they're partners and that he's investigating a murder, is that he's gonna end up in over his head, which is kind of the consistent story of Eugene in Marvel Comics. And so, of course, Captain America tracks down Eugene, ends up at the lair of Yellow Claw, and is also ensnared. And so with the two of them being captured, Eugene having been the cause of it all, that of course this leads to Spider-Man encountering Vincent, the father of Eugene, who's aware of what Eugene was doing, and then tells Spider-Man what's going on because his concern is that Eugene's in over his head. Spider-Man figures out what's happening pretty fast, and of course assembles a full contingent of the Defenders, and they of course rescue Captain America and Eugene, after which Eugene is yelled at for a little while, and then that's basically it. But following this, and this is really one of the more disappointing things about his character, following this, there wasn't a whole lot doing about his character, right? In Spectacular Spider-Man issues 184 and 185, which again were also written by J.M.D. Mateus, he appeared again, didn't really have much of an event here. He appeared in a handful of stories following that. There was one point during Punisher War Journal when he was basically brought in, and he was essentially one of the people who were almost animal in nature. They were being hunted by Kraven the Hunter as almost a sort of blend between legitimately hunting animals and the story of the most dangerous game. It was just one of these instances when he just kind of bounced around here and there and never really had any major significant moments in Marvel Comics. He did appear in events like Avengers The Initiative. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, The Initiative was an actual publishing line by Marvel Comics that was based off the events of Civil War, that the entire gist and the entire ideology behind Civil War, as most of you guys know, was basically a war fought between the various superheroes on whether or not they should have to register with the federal government. That in in the end, the bad guys won, right? Iron Man and Reed Richards and Hank Pym and those guys ended up coming out on top. Iron Man became director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Hank Pym and Reed Richards were able to launch the 50-State Initiative, which was essentially a government-sanctioned superhero team, each of which would exist in the various 50 states. That Frogman was a part of that. That you also saw him appearing in small things like Secret Invasion, where it turned out he was a Skrull and so on and so forth, but this notion of his early appearances back in the 80s being very comedic stories, instances where he would just appear and usually screw things up, that it just never really seemed to quite come back again. And even more recently, in Christopher Cantwell's run of Iron Man during the books of Korvac, that while that story, which of course we did cover, that story focused heavily on Michael Korvac basically returning and then trying to acquire the power cosmic of Galactus yet again, which both he and Iron Man succeeded in doing, which is, you heard that right, Iron Man basically became God. I'll link the playlist down in the description. I'll link the Iron Man playlist so you can watch all the Iron Man videos. It was a phenomenal story, but basically what you had here is Tony Stark assembling a team that would go under the radar of Michael Korvac. The reason being because if he assembled the Avengers, or if he had reassembled ForceWorks, or any number of teams that were in some form or fashion high profile, it would have drawn the attention of Korvac. The desire was to race to the ship of Galactus and essentially seize the power cosmic before Michael Korvac did. Such as it was, both Iron Man and Korvac accessed the power cosmic seemingly at the same time, and their stories kind of went forward from there. But for Frogman, what was so funny about this is that in order to assemble a team that would simply fly under the radar, Iron Man basically grabbed a whole bunch of street level and like Z-list characters. So one of those, of course, was Frogman. And of course, the team was basically christened the Space Friends, which I love. I love that name. The Space Friends was such a great name for that team. The funny thing about this is that when Frogman was initially approached by Iron Man to join the team, it was one of those things where he was like, finally, I get to team up with like a serious superhero and I get to go on like a real adventure. And he did. And it was amazing. It was a fantastic story. You guys are welcome to check it out if you guys want to see what it was about. But outside of that, again, when it comes to Frogman, he had a really interesting run in the early days. But once JMD Mateus had sort of moved away from Marvel Comics, that you basically saw other writers kind of throwing him in there here and there. Roger Stern, people like that, they were kind of throwing him in, and then that was basically it, right? He would just sort of appear, his comedic nature was sort of gone. He would have these small little moments and so on, but there really wasn't a whole lot doing there. Instead, his real kind of return to form has sort of come during Christopher Cantwell's run, but we don't know how much longer that's going to go. So at the end of the day, that really is all who Frogman is. He's a kid that just wanted to become a superhero, so he stole his dad's villain costume and then basically bungled everything up. But you can't help but cheer for him because his heart is in the right place. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.